become very challenging that political violence has become an acceptable form for many Americans of expressing dissent. And it is unacceptable, whether it's directed at Republicans or Democrats or independents, members of Congress, the Senate, governors, mayors, city council members, presidents, presidential candidates. It's just not who we are.
Nice warm welcome for you. Well, hello and welcome to today's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Marisa Lagos. I'm a politics correspondent with KQED here in San Francisco, and I co-host the Political Breakdown podcast. Now it is my pleasure to introduce House Minority Leader Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. He is also author of the new children's book, The ABCs of Democracy. Congressman Jeffries was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. He is currently serving his sixth term in the U.S. Congress and represents the 8th Congressional District of New York. And 2 years ago, in November 2022, he was unanimously elected House Democratic Leader. He is a dedicated advocate for economic and social justice and served 6 years in the New York State Assembly. Congratulations and welcome. Thanks for being here.
Good afternoon. Great to be with all of you.
Well, I do want to talk about your new book, but I think we got to start with the news, right? So, surprising nobody, this was not the election outcome that you wanted. I'm curious, as you are touring the country right now, talking to folks about this book and about what's next, what lessons are you taking away from what happened last month?
Well, good afternoon again. Great to be here at the Commonwealth Club. Great to be in the historic All-American city of San Francisco, of course, which we know the city of San Francisco has given the world many things, including Joe DiMaggio, Willie Mays, Willie McCovey, Willie Brown, and Nancy D'Alessandro Pelosi. So we're thankful. Great to be here. But, I think for me, the disappointment of the election as we process what took place certainly across the country, within the battleground states and beyond, I think the clear message was that the American people want the Congress and those in government to deal with the dramatically high cost of living that is impacting working class people of every race and of every region all across the land. And as the party in power, though under the leadership of President Biden and Vice President Harris, so much good was done emerging from the pandemic to try to get things turned around. That, of course, was up against a backdrop of decades of things moving in the wrong direction for working class Americans in terms of jobs and wages, and the situation of post-pandemic inflation. And when you think about the economy, of course, economists will look at the economy and they'll judge it through historically low unemployment, the record job creation, of course, the macroeconomic environment, even wages, beginning to move, in the right direction, inflation coming down, of course, over the last 2 years in particular, gas prices cooling off as well. But for everyday Americans, understandably, who are struggling to live paycheck to paycheck, they will view the economy through the lens of, what am I paying for groceries, gas, of course, and housing? And so many people have been hit so hard in those areas that I think it did work against Vice President Harris and, Democrats in our efforts with respect to both the House and the Senate, though we certainly have kept it very close in the House of Representatives.
I was looking at the numbers. It's a hair of a margin there. I mean, you mentioned COVID, and obviously, globally, that is still having such an impact. But also the last decade has very much been sort of colored by Donald Trump. And I Can't help reflecting that his sort of populist and outsider message has forced Democrats into defending the status quo. And to your point, a lot of people don't feel like the status quo is working for them. So as one of the leaders of this party, I mean, what kind of soul searching needs to be happening? Is this a messaging challenge? Is this a policy challenge? Do Democrats need to, I don't know, kind of start from scratch and thinking about how they're approaching all of this?
Well, first of all, I think it is important to know that we've seen the pendulum at the national level consistently swing back and forth. Now, this is a dramatic swing given who's heading back to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Don't want to discount that at all. But of course, if you look at the last 45 plus years, you had George H.W. Bush, who had a term. Pendulum then swung from Bush to Clinton, who had 8 years. Clinton then yielded to George W. Bush. Pendulum swung back in the other direction for 8 years. Dramatically different policies that were put into place at that point in time. After the 8 years of George W. Bush, pendulum then swung dramatically back in the other direction. President Barack Obama, who had a full 8 years as well, of course, then significant pendulum swing from a president. I'm trying to be as diplomatic as I can. It's the holiday season.
But yeah, to your point, in 2012, the narrative was Republicans are done. They're never going to get voters of color. Like, that wasn't that long ago.
That's
right?
correct. No, that wasn't that long ago at all. Pendulum then swung back to Donald Trump, who represented, I think, for many Americans, dramatic change, who were upset with the status quo, really a stick of dynamite that was going to be rolled into Washington, D.C. to blow the whole thing up, with some Americans saying, we'll see what happens, can't get any worse because of our situation. And, of course, we saw that it could get worse. Tried to detonate the Affordable Care Act, imposed the GOP tax scam, and of course, lost reproductive freedom for millions of Americans as a result of his Supreme Court appointments. Pendulum then swings back in the other direction with President Joe Biden, and then, of course, now back in the other direction for Donald Trump. So that's the natural ebb and flow, because there's a broad dissatisfaction. And I think what it connects with is that the basic contract between so many Americans and our great country has always been that if you work hard and play by the rules, you should be able to provide a comfortable living for yourself, for your family, purchase a home, educate your children, have access to high quality health care, go on vacation every now and then, live that comfortable life, and one day retire with grace and dignity. But for far too many Americans who are struggling to survive and live paycheck to paycheck, there's a feeling that that basic American contract has been broken. And the party in power is the one that will always pay the price, even though this has been a decades-long phenomenon. So I think the takeaway from this election has to be that we need to decisively work on this issue, not as Democrats or independents or Republicans, but as Americans, to make sure that every single person in the land can have access to that great American middle-class dream and beyond.
Of course, for the next at least 2 years in the House, you will be in, the opposition party. And we were talking a little backstage. The reaction from Democrats, both in California and DC, nationally, is more muted than in 2016, right? This was less of a shock. And it was more of a clean sweep. I mean, he did win the popular vote. It is both houses of Congress. How do you want to approach this then? Because, he is the democratically elected president. They're, your colleagues in the House you will have to work with if you want to get anything done. How are you kind of thinking about that, given a lot of the bombs that Trump, quite frankly, is already throwing out?
Well, I think our view is that, we will work as hard as we can to find bipartisan common ground with the incoming administration and our Republican colleagues on any issue, whenever and wherever possible, if it'll make a difference in the lives of the American people. But at the same period of time, push back against far-right extremism whenever necessary. and be very clear in how we define that. We will always work to protect and strengthen Social Security, protect and strengthen Medicare, protect the Affordable Care Act, protect the progress that we've made to combat the climate crisis, and we will always fiercely defend a woman's freedom to make her own reproductive health care decisions. And we're going to draw a line in the sand as it relates to protecting the things that clearly still matter to the American people and not allow a far-right agenda to take hold, which we believe is still inconsistent with the results of the election. Yes, it's clear that the incoming president won and swept all of the battleground states. It was still overall basically a 50-49 election. Now things broke that 1% against the vice president across the country. We accept the results of that election, but the reality is it's not an overwhelming mandate to drive hard right policies and jam them down the throats of the American people. In fact, when Donald Trump first took office in January of 2017, his margins in the House were 241 Republicans to 194 Democrats. His margin this time around, that was an overwhelming majority that he had in the House of Representatives. His margin this time around, before vacancies, at best will be 220 Republicans, 215 Democrats. The closest House of any incoming majority since before the Great Depression. Mm-hmm. The American people are clearly saying, we want you all to work together to solve problems in a common sense fashion. And that's what we're going to work hard to do.
And that's why he's the minority leader. The math and the number facts always impress me. What's your relationship like with the president-elect? Have you spoken with him? I know you were one of the House impeachment managers the first impeachment time around. How would you describe your relationship?
Developing.
I'll leave it there. How about with Speaker Mike Johnson?
Well, with Speaker Mike Johnson, I spoke to him just earlier today, and we have a pretty, open, communicative, forward-looking relationship.
Very different people.
They're very different individuals. Yeah. And I got to know Mike Johnson. We both served on the Judiciary Committee together before I transitioned into House Democratic leadership and before he transitioned into Republican leadership. And we come from obviously very different backgrounds, but as I think he demonstrated throughout this current Congress, where Democrats were by necessity in a position where we had to step in repeatedly to try to make sure things happened the right way for the American people, including avoiding a catastrophic default on our nation's debt, which would have crashed the economy, keeping the government open on 5 different occasions, making sure we funded the government in a manner that met the needs of the American people in terms of their health, safety, national security, and economic well-being. And then, of course, worked to get critical funding for our democratic ally, Ukraine, in a fight to make sure that the free world as it currently exists can sustain itself. We were able to find the common ground necessary. And even though he would have to break in some of those instances with the hard right, once he gave his word, he kept his word. And that's the basis of a relationship where you can agree to disagree without being disagreeable with each other.
Yeah, how do you, as you mentioned at the top, you're sitting in Nancy Pelosi's city. I would count her as one of the sort of most talented legislative leaders, maybe of American history. How do you see his relationship with his caucus? Obviously, it'll be a new class coming in, but what have you just observed about his leadership style?
Well, it's a challenging situation he has to confront when you have Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and Jim Jordan in the same group, just to name 3.
Right.
But, in many ways, that kind of extremism has just grown unchecked on the other side of the aisle. And it created a lot of challenges for them in terms of governing in this Congress, but with a President Biden and Democrats in charge in the Senate and House Democrats being willing to step in to make sure we can do the right thing consistent with our values for the American people, we were able to avoid a lot of damage being done to the American people, notwithstanding the challenges that Speaker Johnson has within his own conference. Now, heading into the new Congress, those challenges, I think, are only going to grow.
Yeah.
Because
it's hard to have all the levers of power sometimes.
yeah, and at this point, the Republican strategy, I think, traditionally has been to blame and complain, right? When there are Democrats in office. And it's very rare that we've actually seen a forward-looking vision for how to solve the problems that the American people want us to address. But we're going to blame Joe Biden or blame Kamala Harris or blame Democrats in the House and the Senate, complain about, the issues that understandably the American people want us to work on, like border security, for instance, or public safety, and certainly dealing with inflation, but not offering any constructive solutions to resolve those challenges. But it's a lot harder to engage in the blame and complain strategy successfully when you now have the responsibility to govern.
Yeah.
And that's going to be one of the big challenges that they will face in the new Congress.
Yeah, it's like becoming a parent. Suddenly you're in charge. Like, what are you going to do? Before we move on to some more current events and things, I would love, and I'm sure everyone here would love to hear a little bit about your relationship with Nancy Pelosi. I know she, I think, has mentored you and obviously is sticking around a little longer. So talk about that. And because that's unusual, right? To have somebody step out of the speaker role and stick around. But really, I think my sense is that she's really tried to just be supportive, not kind of Bigfoot you in any way.
Yeah, no, without question. In fact, one, it was just such an honor to be able to serve with Speaker Emerita Pelosi in leadership. I was the chair of the caucus between 2019 and 2022 before the transition was made. So was able to sit at the leadership table, work through under her leadership a lot of the challenges that we face. And I think, as you indicated, will unquestionably, go down in history as one of the greatest legislative leaders of any party, any House of Congress, in any century in America. Now, what I found out is it ain't easy to follow Michael Jordan, y'all. But we have worked. Or should I say Steph Curry? I'm here in here in the Bay Area.
That's not even to talk about her shoe game, right?
Right, that's right. But I do think that it's been a great transition, passing of the torch to a new generation of legislative leaders, which includes Pete Aguilar from California, the caucus chair, of course, and Catherine Clark is doing an amazing job as whip of the Democratic caucus. And then, myself as well. And Speaker Pelosi was pretty clear very early on when she made the transition. And she said, I'm going to stick around because there are issues that I want to fight for in the Bay Area. And the people that I've represented for such a long period of time have given me the grace and the space to serve in national leadership. I want to be able to work on some things that need, to be concluded, which we all respected. And at the same period of time, she said, and I'm not going to be around she said this publicly, so I'm not talking out of school, I'm not going to be around to be the mother-in-law in the kitchen who says, my son Tommy doesn't like his spaghetti sauce made that way. And to her credit, she's there for us to talk to get her perspective, because it will be foolhardy on these big issues not to get her sense of how we're thinking about things and her perspective, which we do, but also has given us the space to try to lead the House Democratic Caucus into the future.
Yeah. How often would you say you talk with her?
Talk
Or
to her-
has it changed since the beginning? Was it more often then?
No, well, I think I try to get her perspective, particularly when we're dealing with, some significant issues. Let her know how I'm thinking about it, and talk to her as recently as probably about a week ago. Certainly in the aftermath, of the election, and leading up to the election, of course, on the non-governmental side. What's been fascinating is that, in this Congress, we've been tested so much by so many different issues, as you all remember, in January of 2023, which became the basis of the book in terms of my remarks. But the week that preceded my first floor remarks as House Democratic leader, there were 15 different votes before the Republicans could actually even elect the speaker at the time. That was the longest period of delay in the start of a Congress since before the Civil War. And then we narrowly avoided a catastrophic default on America's debt, and we had to step in to prevent that from happening. That was in May of last year. Then we came back from the traditional August work period, and then Speaker McCarthy unilaterally announced an impeachment inquiry against President Biden. And then at the end of September of last year, we narrowly avoided a government shutdown for the first of what turned out to be 5 times. Then a few days after that, the motion to vacate was brought against Speaker McCarthy. It was successful. That had never happened before. We were without a speaker for 2.5 weeks. Ongoing conflicts in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. Then I think in the middle of November of last year, we narrowly avoided a government shutdown for the second time. A few weeks after that, George Santos was expelled. That was a good thing, y'all. That was a good thing. But that then triggered a high-stakes special election in Nassau County in my own backyard that was a new political test for the House Democratic leaders that we had to win, and thankfully with help from many people in the Bay Area, we were successful in flipping that seat. But all of that is happening in my first year. And I remember going home during the holiday season around this time, having to ask the question, how exactly did I get myself into this situation? But what I had to conclude in the midst of all of that, and certainly based on what we are now heading into, that calm is an intentional decision, that we can't control the extraordinary nature of the unprecedented events that we're all experiencing, because this is a moment where we're just dealing with one unprecedented occurrence after the next. But you can control how you respond. And in that regard, it is critically important to remain calm, that is an intentional decision. And when you do that, you can try to deal with the problem set that's in front of you, in a serious and a sober and a substantive fashion with perspective that gives you the best possibility to get the situation turned around. And that's been the approach that I think the new House Democratic leaders have taken. And I think it's served the caucus well up until this point. We got a whole new set of problems that we're going to confront on January 20th, but we'll be prepared to deal with it, and we'll work to make sure we can get America through it once again.
Well, before we get to that, I did want to ask about a few bits of news that happened in the last few days. President Joe Biden announced that he would be pardoning his son, Hunter Biden. I know some critics say that this is sort of giving Trump a permission structure, which I don't know that he needs, but what are your thoughts on the pardon itself, and do you think it will make your job any harder or change anything moving forward?
Well, I definitely don't think that there's anything that's going to give Donald Trump a permission structure that he doesn't believe that he already has. And we're going to have to confront those challenges on January 20th and beyond, and we will. And we'll take them as they come. I also do think, however, that we can't fall into the trap of being outraged every day by the things that Donald Trump does. because I'm convinced that it's part of an intentional strategy to keep us distracted and not to communicate with the American people on the issues that really matter and will be decisive in 2026, building toward 2028. We do have to make sure we are protecting our institutions and our norms and our values, and there will be a lot to be outraged about. So we have to strike the right balance there. But that's going to be critically important for all of us as we enter into this new period. In terms of the decision by President Biden, I haven't had a chance to talk to him or the White House yet since I've been traveling and been on the road. But the way I at least interpreted initially is that this was being done through the lens of a father and his love for his son and his concern, particularly given what President Biden and his family has been through, going all the way back to when he was first elected to the Senate. Tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And, I think at least as of the moment, I'll leave it at that.
Do you think it gives any credence to right-wing views that, because he's saying, the president is, that this is a politically motivated prosecution, and you see a lot of the people Trump is nominating to lead intelligence, defense, law enforcement, kind of that's their line, that so much of this has been politically motivated. Do you think it gives credence to that?
I think that President Biden has been appropriately concerned from the beginning that the right wing within Congress and across the country has made his son a major target and has fostered this environment where people have felt compelled to go after his son. And, I think objectively you'll have lawyers. I'm just a recovering one. But you'll have lawyers, who will make the cases to whether this was selective prosecution or not. And whether
that is the pardon power too, that that it's different than any other part of our justice system.
Yeah.
It does give the president a lot of authority.
It actually is one of the remnants of sort of the prior system that existed, that was built into the Constitution and has continued both for presidents, of course, and for executives at the state level as governors.
Yeah. Another thing that you unfortunately had to deal with over the holiday weekend was a number of bomb threats against House members, particularly in Connecticut. I know those were Democrats. There was also swatting and some threats made of Trump cabinet picks. You came out very forcefully talking about not only the, how unacceptable political violence is, but the need to protect members. How do you think about that moving forward? I mean, obviously, Nancy Pelosi and her family were the subject of a horrific attack. We've seen just this spread of political violence, and it does seem like you and your members need support.
Yeah, it's become a very challenging development over the last several years, even prior to the events of January 6th, but escalating thereafter, that political violence has become an acceptable form for many Americans of expressing dissent. And it is unacceptable, whether it's directed at Republicans or Democrats or independents, members of Congress, the Senate, governors, mayors, city council members, presidents, presidential candidates. It's just not who we are. And it's going to be incumbent on all of us to speak up forcefully against it, make sure that those who perpetrate it are investigated and prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and to demand better from everyone, including the incoming president, as it relates to the tone that will be set. And, part of the challenge is in the House, there are 435 members. And we pride ourselves in the House as being the institution that the framers designed to be the closest to the American people. And to reflect the hopes, the dreams, the aspirations, the fears, the concerns, the anxieties, the life experiences, and the passions of the American people, and to be present and to be on the ground and to interact with voters our constituents in the most intimate, direct ways possible. That is what the House was supposed to be. I think it was John Adams who said, when they were contemplating the House, that it should be an exact portrait of the American people in terms of our thoughts, our ideas, what we look like. Now, I'm sure that John Adams never imagined a Hakeem Sekou Jeffries, but they set us on a course for the House to continue to grow and develop in that fashion. It's the reason why the House, of course, has the 2-year term as compared to the 4-year term of the president, the 6-year term of the Senate, or life tenure for the Supreme Court, which, by the way, first opportunity we get, we're going to do something about that. But when you think about it, 2, 4, 6, life, that's the spectrum. And so the House, by definition, is designed to be like the people, with the people, of the people, interacting with the American people. And so we've got to figure out a way in that context where we want to be able to continue to do our jobs effectively, but in an era of political violence, I call for maximum protection.
Yeah. Is that something, I mean, I know in the past there's been debates, and often Republicans have not been as supportive of increasing that type of security. Is that something you think you can find common ground on?
It is something that we hope to find bipartisan common ground on. Of course, many of my Republican colleagues themselves fell victim to political violence at the congressional baseball game. I think it was about 8 years ago. And Steve Scalise, of course, was very seriously injured, still battling through 8 years later, a lot of those challenges. But in fact, if Steve Scalise wasn't there, because there are 5 members of Congress who have round-the-clock security detail, it's the 2 members of the minority in leadership, at this moment, myself and Catherine Clark, and the 3 members in the majority who are in leadership, of which Scalise was, I think, the whip at the time. Right. And so he was playing baseball and had security there who were able to subdue the shooter. If not, a greater tragedy could have occurred. Yeah. And so I think we do have to find a way to work together based on our mutual experiences in dealing with this issue to better protect the public servants so we can do our jobs on behalf of the American people.
All right, one more piece of recent news, which is that in Orange County, Derek Tran, Democrat, beat incumbent Michelle Steele. This was this is a seat the Democrats have fought hard for the last few cycles. It means that of the open or swing seats, Republicans kept 2, really, in Inland Empire, Central Valley. This one went to the Dems. This one went to the Dems. Katie Porter's seat went to the Dems. We're still waiting on this one out in Modesto. Just talk about that and why you think in places like New York and California, Democrats did kind of outperform what happened nationally.
Yeah, it's very interesting that in New York, even though Donald Trump did better this election than he had done in New York previously in either 2016 or 2020, in some places, by 10 or 15 points. I think he got about 5% of the vote in the South Bronx in 2016, got 25% of the vote in the South Bronx this time around. Again, we have to work through unpacking all of these issues, particularly amongst working class voters and working class voters of color in many areas. But notwithstanding the fact that across the state, Donald Trump did better in New York than he had previously done, and in California, did better in California than he had previously done in the swing seats. This year, in New York alone, we flipped 4 seats that were held by Republicans. Now will be held by Democrats. And in California, 2 have already been flipped, George Whitesides and Derek Tran. The Dave Menz seat was protected, and that was a tough hold that Katie Porter currently represents. And Adam Gray in the Central Valley is up, and as early as later on today, could be declared the victor and would be a 3rd pickup in California. And so I think what it does say is that while there was a Trump electoral college wave, and he did better in many blue states across the country, that down ballot, Democrats still found in a tough environment a lot of success. And in fact, in the House, of the 31 vulnerable incumbents who were running for re-election, 27 won. Of the 5 seats that fell into the category of the Katie Porter seat, which were tough seats held by Democratic incumbents who ran for other offices, and therefore we had to protect those seats. There were 5 across the country, we held 4. Only one that we lost was the Alyssa Slotkin seat, who now is on her way to being a senator, but we lost that seat by a few points. In Michigan, we held the others, and in fact, we have now flipped 8 Republican-held seats this Congress, which is more than the Republicans, but because of some gerrymandering challenges, we think will ultimately account for the difference of 3 seats where we'll fall short. I say all that to say that, it's important to take the right messages from the American people. And it is an evenly divided House. And they do want us to work together. And that's what we're determined to do. They are not authorizing a wholesale eradication of the things that the American people still value and that we will work hard to defend.
Well, you're here because you wrote a book. It's not, I would say, a totally traditional children's book. For those who don't know, tell them how this came about. This was a speech you gave, basically, right?
Yeah, it's an illustrated book for people of all ages, the young and the young at heart. But it was based off of a set of remarks that I delivered during the first speech that I gave as House Democratic leader, really just laying out the values that I thought were important to the American journey and the things that we were going to fight hard as Democrats to protect, and then contrasting that with values that represented what could be the ugly underbelly of any society. And, I made the decision that I would use the lens of the alphabet to try to illustrate in the most impactful way in that speech that I gave, which wound up laying out 26 values that were affirmative American values and the corollary to that. And I thought about it afterward because, there's no teleprompter in the House of Representatives except for when the president delivers a State of the Union address. And I generally don't like to speak with notes. And so I go through this, and 26 letters in the alphabet.
So wait, had you conceived it ahead of time?
I conceived it, yeah. And remember, there were 15 different votes. It lasted all week, so I had some time to think about what I was going to say.
Fair.
I still had to make the call to do it. And thankfully, I got through it, and seemingly well received. But I remember saying to someone afterward, I will never attempt that again. I said, why? It seemed to go well. I said, well, because there were 52 opportunities to make an easily ascertainable mistake. Jump over a letter, skip a letter of the alphabet, and the right-wing media would have had a field day. New House Democratic leader doesn't even know the alphabet. But thankfully, we got through it.
And we got a couple like my name, maturity over Mar-a-Lago. But there's I was reading this with my 8-year-old actually, and it spurred some benevolence over bigotry. These aren't, words that all kids know. Is that your hope that if you do read it with your child that it would spark a conversation?
Yeah, and I think that it'll be age appropriate for parents as they decide when they want to introduce these concepts about who we are as a country, the American journey. But it also reflects for all of us, particularly at a moment of turbulence, the fact that we've been on this journey for 248 years. And we're about to approach our 250th birthday. That's an incredible thing. And elections come, elections go, presidents come, presidents go. Democracy has endured. And that's going to need to continue. And what are the elements of that? And I endeavored to lay out 26 of them. I think in thinking about one of the takeaways from the election, the letter W, I talk about working families over the well-connected. And the point that so many people feel like their government has failed them and that it's working for those who are well-connected, for big donors, and not for the people who are just struggling to live paycheck to paycheck. And the Democratic Party, since FDR, has always been about that. And we, I think, emerging from this moment, have to figure out a way to reconnect.
Yeah.
Because our hearts are in the right place, our policies are in the right place, our values are in the right place, but we just have to make sure that we make that connection in a more powerful and intimate way.
Well, one of your jobs is to move the party forward. You represent a new generation of leadership. One of our audience members asked, how can we move the Democratic caucus into the new generations, younger generations? And they mention, the possibility of replacing some committee chairs. I know there's been talk about Jamie Raskin challenging Representative Jerry Nadler. I guess more broadly, though, how are you thinking about, your leadership team and who, should it be about seniority or should it be about who's best sort of equipped to push back on the Trump administration and the Republicans?
Well, I think the caucus perspective will be, as it works its will, that we need our best. We need all of our players on the field, all of our players. It's all hands on deck at the moment, but we need everyone playing the right position. And we've got to make sure that with everyone on the field, that everyone is playing the right position. And I think in the context of what may happen with some of the committees moving forward. I guess earlier today, former Chairman Raul Grijalva announced that he was not going to seek his position as ranking member on the Natural Resources Committee, and that the torch would be passed to Jared Huffman, a Bay Area Congress member, a very visionary Congress member, classmate of mine. And Raul Grijalva has had a tremendous run. He's done a lot of good. He's been a great leader in that regard on natural resources, and now the torch is being passed, and it wouldn't surprise me to see that happen in some other areas.
Yeah. I want to ask about what's sort of been, what we can see shaping up, which is the Trump cabinet and his nominees, and it feels sort of broadly that, well, maybe two things. So a lot of these almost seem aimed at getting a rise out of Democrats. But also just that so many of these people have very little experience running large organizations. And you think about something like Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon. I mean, this is, 5 million employees? This is the biggest bureaucracy maybe in the world. What concerns do you have about that beyond the policy differences, just the experience level?
Well, the incoming president promised the country the very best, right? You're going to get the best economy. You're going to get the best border security. You're going to get the best administration. And it's clear that some of these nominees are not the best that America can do at all, by far. And, one of the things I talk about in the book under the letter C is the Constitution over the cult. And what inspired me to use that phraseology.
Another word I had to explain to my child this morning.
That's right.
Cult.
Cult.
Yeah.
And, George Washington, of course, in his farewell address to the Congress now, term limits for presidents did not set in until the 1940s when the Constitution was changed. And, given the role that George Washington played in the Revolutionary War, and he was a great general and a war hero, there were many who were of the view that, well, he could effectively serve for life and become the first American king, but made the decision to stand down after his second term because what was being built in America was very different, something anchored in the rule of law, not the rule of man. We're going to have to deal with that challenge moving forward, but that's been an enduring principle going all the way back to George Washington when he made the statement in his farewell address that the Constitution is sacredly obligatory upon all, no exceptions, obligatory on presidents, on the Senate, on the judges, on the House, on people of wealth, on people of limited means, sacredly obligatory upon all. And in the context, and there are features to that, including separate but co-equal branches of government, as well as this principle of checks and balances, and in the Senate, advice and consent.
Right.
And there are going to be a lot of challenges in dealing with this moving forward, but what we can say is at least in the context of the first test, which was the Attorney General nomination, that it was passed. Matt Gaetz will not be the next Attorney General of the United States of America. First test. Many more in front of us.
Right.
But that principle connected to advice and consent meaning something, and the Constitution meaning something, as opposed to a cult of personality, was passed, there will be many more ahead of us.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, well, one, I think there's widespread sort of thought that the Senate is not going to reject, a dozen of his, that they might kind of pick and choose. And in some ways, you could argue this is exactly what Trump promised. I mean, Kash Patel at the FBI, he's basically been out there talking for months like he was going to get this position. So how do you think about pushing back, without maybe alienating voters who Democrats might need in the future, even when it's someone like Patel who has promised a campaign of retribution, which, and to shut down the FBI headquarters. I don't really know what that means, actually, but it's got to be a balance for you guys, right?
Yeah, and I think at least my initial view of it is that we have to present the question to the American people. What does the chaos, what does the dysfunction, what does the extremism have to do with improving your quality of life? What does it have to do with solving problems on your behalf? What does it have to do, perhaps most importantly, with driving down the high cost of living? And I think the more that we can be clear that, the chaos that we'll see and the dysfunction and the extremism is not doing anything to address the challenges that the American people clearly said they want addressed, then it is inconsistent with the votes that were cast last month. And there will be a price to pay for that in terms of accountability, both in the off-year elections in November and more significantly the midterm elections in 2026. And this stems from a principle that Abraham Lincoln once articulated, which is that public sentiment is everything. Public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. And while temporarily we will not have the gavels in our hands in January, we do have the ability to shape public sentiment. And that will be an incredibly important part of our mission over the next few years to find the common ground that is necessary, but push back against the extremism whenever possible and make sure that we can swing the pendulum of public sentiment back in a direction that we feel is more constructive, more enlightened for the American people.
Well, we have some audience questions about how they can kind of help with that. What are the best ways for the public to make their voices heard? Best being most impactful? Is it calling congressmen, participating in civil liberties groups? Somebody else wants to know specifically, what do you think women in ages 25 to 50 should be doing to fight back? Canvassing in red states, running for office? A lot there.
All of the above. But I do think it is important to appropriately re-engage democracy is not a self-executing proposition. It doesn't run on autopilot. It does take, a citizenry that is willing at every level to get involved in helping to make sure that you hold the government accountable for doing the things that should be done to improve lives. And when the moment is right, electorally, to try to work as hard as you can to ensure that the people who are being elected share your values. And in part, that does require a new generation of folks to be willing to step forward, pursue public service, jump into these races, understanding the rough and tumble of politics. It is challenging. And the one thing that I say to young people is to remember, it doesn't mean you'll always be successful. There is going to be heartbreak. There's going to be disappointing results. And for so many Americans, millions of Americans, tens of millions of Americans, the results in the general election were very disappointing. But we have to work through those disappointments and stay on the playing field in different ways. Now, re-engage at the right moment. And I understand why some have turned inward to their families and the things that they enjoy doing in the holiday season, and that all is a healthy thing to do. But I think we are going to need people over time to make sure in a democracy, in a democratic republic, they re-engage. And understand, I say this to young people all the time, I ran twice for office, lost twice before I won my first race. George W. Bush lost his first congressional race. Bill Clinton lost his first congressional race. Barack Obama lost his first congressional race by 26 points to the then incumbent Bobby Rush, who we served with for a long period of time. Bobby Rush has never let us forget that fact. But I think it was Churchill who once said that, success is not final, failure is not fatal. All that matters is the courage to continue. And, I put it a different way. I said knockdown is different from a knockout. That's the Hakeem Jeffries remix, y'all. But success is not final, failure is not fatal. All that matters is the courage to continue. We have to have the courage to stay in the fight, to re-engage, and to continue the journey that America has been on for 248 years, and with continued engagement, will stay on.
I have a question from a slightly different perspective. You talk about fighting for the far right agenda, but what are you doing to rein in the far left agenda?
It's an important question, and I do think that what the American people have said they want us to do is to govern with common sense. Now, I do think that a center-left agenda is popular when properly communicated as to what we are endeavoring to do. Every single thing that we were able to accomplish, under President Biden's leadership and Vice President Harris, historic things that were done, the American Rescue Plan, shots in arms, money in pockets, kids back in school, rescuing the economy from a once-in-a-century pandemic and allowing the economy to be on a trajectory to perform better than any other advanced economy in the world, while recognizing that more, of course, still needs to be done. But that was a center-left policy that was enacted into law that was a good development for working-class Americans and for the American people. It was a common-sense thing to do. And then we, of course, moved from there to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It was bipartisan, but led by Democrats, creating millions of good-paying jobs all across the country, including in parts of the country where jobs have gone in the wrong direction, fixing our crumbling bridges, roads, and tunnels, our airports, our sewer and water systems, our mass transit systems, and high-speed internet access in every single community, clean water for every single community, no more Flint, Michigans and Jackson, Mississippi's. That was a great thing to do, center-left policy that was enacted into law. And then we moved from there to common sense gun safety that was also bipartisan, but led by Democrats. First gun safety law passed in more than 30 years that will save lives. We know we of course have to do more, but that was a common sense approach to things. And just a few other things that we did, amongst many, the Ships and Science Act, to make sure that we are centering innovation as we should here in America, but bringing these domestic manufacturing jobs in the connection to semiconductors back home to the United States of America, as opposed to our jobs going in the other direction, and the Inflation Reduction Act, where we are dramatically lowering the high price of life-saving prescription drugs for millions of Americans, and the largest investment in combating the climate crisis in the history of the world. Not a single one of the things that we were able to do when Democrats had the House, the Senate, and the presidency is unpopular. In fact, all of them are very popular. Now, the familiarity is not what it should be in terms of the American people and their awareness of the positive steps that were taken by Democrats. But these were all common sense things. They weren't far left policies, they were common sense things. Center left, democratic, progressive priorities, but popular with the American people when the American people are aware of them. Ultimately, though, elections are about the future, not the past. And in an environment where there was still so much anxiety connected to the economic circumstance of the American people because of the gas prices, the housing prices, and the food prices, ultimately, we faced an electoral headwind that we couldn't overcome.
I have a few questions here about how you and other Democrats can sort of protect democratic institutions, make sure, combat some of the Project 2025 policies. But I think the institutions one is really interesting too, because, we are in an era where people are very skeptical of institutions, not just government. And it does seem to me like that's part of the job if you want to sort of win back this, debate with somebody like the MAGA movement.
The media, the church, the courts, the Congress, the presidency, politics in general, all of these institutions, have plummeted in terms of public sentiment. And I think it can be traced back to that theme that I've consistently brought back up, which is, that there's distrust of institutions when there's significant economic anxiety amongst the electorate. And the real feeling that not only can American families not get ahead, we can't even get by. We can't even get by. And that it's going to be on all of us to decisively address that. But it's the right thing to do. It's what the American dream is all about, economic opportunity for all, regardless of station in life. But it also is critically important to our democracy because, when you see extreme forms of populism flourish in the world and the emergence of, sort of a tendency for some to want to embrace autocracy on the one hand or to abandon, a functional capitalist system on the other and simply say, that government should control all means of production. Whenever extreme forms of populism have some increased resonance in a society, it's because there's so many people who are feeling economically strained. And one of the best things we can do, I think, for our institutions is to make government work to solve the problems that the American people want us to solve. And to draw the connection, perhaps in a better way than we have been able to, as to why America, imperfect, but constructed to always march toward a more perfect union. And these, institutions being an important part of that role. And again, over the next 2 years, a lot of that battle will play out legislatively with these close margins that exist. I've said to the House Democratic Caucus that we have one mission in 2 parts over the next 2 years. One mission in 2 parts. stop Project 2025 and implement Project 2026 and take back control of the House of Representatives.
Another audience member wants to know if you set aside time to connect with Republican colleagues.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there are, the House is very interesting. You get to know some of your Republican colleagues who you serve on committees with, and certainly those that I've gotten to know the best over the years. Trey Gowdy, for instance, very different politics than mine. Jason Chaffetz, as an example.
Those are not the two names I thought you were going to throw out.
Yeah, Doug Collins, interestingly enough. And we were sort of combatants on the Judiciary Committee, and they were strong advocates for their position. But you could find common ground on certain issues. And in fact, with Doug Collins, we were able to work together on historic criminal justice reform that became the First Step Act, largest legislative effort in terms of criminal justice reform in a generation, that ultimately drew the support of progressives and conservatives, the left and the right, Democrats and Republicans, the ACLU and the Koch brothers, the NAACP and the Heritage Foundation, Al Sharpton and Grover Norquist, and ultimately was signed into law by then President Trump. And this was criminal justice reform.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
And what I've found, to your point, is that when you can form a coalition around a piece of legislation anchored in personal relationships of folks who form what I would call the unusual suspects, people who you don't normally expect to partner together because they disagree on a whole set of issues, but are willing to find the common ground to solve one, that yields to legislative magic, where you can actually make something happen, and then build upon that to hopefully continue progress for the American people. So it's certainly something that I will continue to encourage. Now, there are limits to it. I'm not suggesting that I'm going to have coffee with Marjorie Taylor Greene. I will not. There are limits to it.
I'm not going to visit her in Georgia.
But, it is the responsible thing to do to develop a good working relationship with Mike Johnson.
Yeah.
To try to see where we can make progress together.
All right, I have two kind of lighter questions to end. The first is, what's the best part of being minority leader or congressman?
Well, the opportunity to really travel the country and to experience, of course, spend a lot of time out west in California. California is such an important part of the Congress, the congressional delegation, but really to spend time in districts across the country with members, getting to know the people that they represent, because those members ultimately are a reflection of the American people. Mm-hmm. And as I talked about, it's just unique to what the House really is. And, I've got love for the Senate as an institution, but I was at an orientation with some new members, and we did it on the House floor and talked about the majesty of the House floor. And, this, of course, is where, FDR came in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor to rally the American people. It's where Lincoln came, in the middle of the Civil War, to talk to the nation and talk to the Congress, where he said, and it still is the case, that America, the last best hope on earth. It's where LBJ came in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday in Selma to talk about the importance of passing the Voting Rights Act, and ended famously by saying, "We shall overcome." Like, the ability to serve in this institution with this great history and get to know modern day public servants who continue along in that tradition has been amazing. And, the House as compared to the Senate, someone once asked me, I spent some time in the Senate during the first impeachment trial, what's the difference? I said, well, the House is like public school and the Senate's like private school. And I'm a public school kind of guy.
Same here. All right, we only have about a minute left, but this is probably the hardest question I'll ask you all day. Top 3 hip hop songs of all time.
Oh, wow. Wow. Well, you know, I mean, I'll give you my favorite, which is easy. It's from the Notorious B.I.G., and it's Sky's the Limit. And, you know, he just talks about...
I like Juicy, but that's a good one, too.
Yeah, another good one. But, you know, with Sky's the Limit, as suggested by the name of the song, he just really talks about the journey that he was on and how he started from humble beginnings. And, you know, over a few years, emerged as, you know, an extraordinarily successful, internationally renowned hip-hop artist. But it really, I think, is what the reality is, even to this day, for all of us in America. Now, we got to work hard to make sure that that principle of the sky being the limit is equally accessible for everyone. But that has been what America, our great country, has been about. And even in a tough moment like this, and it is a tough moment, and when people I encounter talk about, particularly young people, the disappointment that they're facing at the electoral results going in a different direction, I said, well, just let's take a step back for a moment. And I recall being a young lawyer practicing, being very disappointed with the 2004 election. And thinking, failed war in Iraq, failed war in Afghanistan, mismanaged economy. Best legislative accomplishment was tax cuts for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected. Efforts to try to dismantle Social Security. How could this have happened? I remember thinking, what does this say about America in 2004? Turns out, by the way, you know, who knew George W. Bush would turn out to be such a normal Republican for a lot of people? But at the time, very disturbed at what happened electorally and what it said about America. But when you think about that moment, on that same day, Barack Obama was elected to the United States Senate. This was in 2004, on that same day. 4 years before that, he had actually been denied entry to the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles. Couldn't get in. 4 years later, spoke from the main stage, gave an incredible speech, was then elected to the Senate. George W. Bush wins that election in 2004. Democrats buried in the minority in the House and in the Senate. Just 2 years later, in 2006, big Democratic wave. Democrats take control of the House. Nancy Pelosi becomes the first woman speaker in the history of the Republic. Just 2 years from that disappointment. Unexpectedly, Democrats take control of the Senate as well. And then 4 years from that disappointment in 2004, Barack Obama breaks the ultimate barrier, becomes the Jackie Robinson of the United States of America in politics, becomes the 44th president. And I'll never forget that there were headlines, of course, from all across the country and the world, but one stood out. And it was from a newspaper, prominent newspaper in Western Europe. And it was making reference to Barack Obama's election and all that that meant, and amazed at what America was able to accomplish. And the headline was very simple. It says, America does it again. America does it again. And I think what that suggested is that there have been a lot of trials and tribulations. There's been a lot of turbulence in our 248-year journey. But as John Lewis would often advise us on the floor, when you hit those moments of turbulence, you've got to show up, you've got to stand up, you've got to speak up for what you know is right. Continue to fight to move the country in the right direction. And you'll face disappointment, but you have to fight through that disappointment. And it's a moment that we're once again called upon to do that, to show the resilience necessary. And I'm confident that if we do that, as we've consistently done before, in 2 years, perhaps, but most importantly in 4 years, we're going to bring about results that will move this country back in an enlightened direction. And that somewhere across the world, we'll see that headline again, America does it again.
Thank you to Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. His book is The ABCs of Democracies. You can find it out here or at your local bookstore. And if you would like to support the club's effort in making virtual and in-person programming possible, go to www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Marisa Lagos. Thanks so much and have a great day.
Thanks, Marissa. Thank you, everyone.